In this video, we're going to take a look at Organic Studio's Copper Turquoise. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. A very blue-leaning turquoise. Blue-leaning enough that I double and triple checked the color of this ink. It has the real potential of passing for blue in a professional environment. So, very blue-leaning turquoise. There's a lot of tone variation that you can get depending on the pen, and it delivers on shading most all of the time really well, shading darker to a very definitely blue tone. This performs very well, but it just falls into a range that's not for me. There's not very many turquoise, and the blue part of what I see with wetter pens, it's just not where I go with colors I want. Though a bunch of people at work really liked the color of this ink, and I think that speaks more for it than my opinion, because it falls in that range that's not for me, that so many normies really enjoyed the color. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Pelikan M1005 with a medium nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairefontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get a turquoise tone, very definitely turquoise, and slightly blue leaning, we can say. Now, it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it definitely shades. You can see it not in every word, but definitely on every line. The first word, sickness, the dot of the I, the S's. Inexplicably, in the top to second line, you see it go lighter to darker to lighter to darker, quite a bit of color shifting within that writing. Looking at the medium nib, it's darker than we had with the fine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we still get some very nice shading throughout all of this. Now, this is where we're getting some of the lighter tones that look very blue-leaning turquoise, shading to very definitely blue. So it is kind of holding on to that turquoise tone here with this paper. It's doing a fairly good job, I think. Looking at the double broad, it is much darker than everything else on the page, and it doesn't make me think of turquoise at all, but it is putting down a lot of ink. Really makes me say blue. Now, it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it still shades. It shades just as well as the other writing. However, because so much of this writing is so much darker, it is a little bit harder to see, but it's certainly there. Looking at the back of the page, while nothing bled through and touched the page underneath, you see that in the broad and in the medium, it got very deep into the paper, showing us a bit more aggressive ink than I thought, though mostly I believe you could use the back of the page. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Pelikan M120 Idyllic Blue with a fine nib. A Pelikan P200 with a medium nib. A Pelikan M205, the Duo Highlighter with a double broad nib. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the fine nib, we still have that nice turquoise tone going on here. We're getting no feather. We're getting no spread. We're not getting as much shading or as standout shading as we had on the Clairefontaine. Not really a surprise though, but it is certainly here. You see it in the word these, where my as these ran together on the top line, but you see these starts lighter and gets darker throughout the word. Even seam on the second line, the M is much darker than the rest of the word, or at least a couple tones darker. Looking at the medium nib, it is in general a bit darker than we had with the fine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's shading much, much better than we had in the fine, really showing off what this ink can do, even on this paper that's not meant for fountain pens, which shows that this ink in itself can do some very nice things. Though I have to say the back of that last page with Clairefontaine has me a little worried for the rest of this writing. Looking at the double broad, we see that it's a little bit darker, just a little bit darker than the medium. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, just there. It is shading. It doesn't look particularly good to me on this. The turquoise blue that I'm getting is really in that range that I'm not enjoying the most, but I'm never going to mention that again. Looking at the back of the page, we see that this did better than the Clairefontaine. We get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problems. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a Field Notes reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we're still holding on to that turquoise tone. We're getting no feather. We're getting no spread. We're getting only the slightest bits of shading. There's almost none to really speak of, although it is there. When it gets to the fourth line of writing, when you look at the word attained on the right side, you'll see it's lighter and a bit darker at the top and a bit darker towards the end of the word. So it does come through, but don't really count on it here with this paper. Looking at the medium nib, we get the same tone that we had with the fine. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get no shading. It's a nice color on here. I think it looks nicer on this paper than it did on the WritePad. But it's not showing any of those other qualities. The paper's really eating up what it has to offer. Looking at the double broad nib, we get a little bit darker tone, just a little bit darker than we had with the other nibs on this paper. We do get the tiniest bit of feathering all the way around in everything, but it's really small. We do get a little bit of spread that's going on, but this is a very wet pen, and this paper is not made for fountain pens. We're not getting any kind of shading, and we shouldn't be expecting it on this paper, so it's doing very well. Looking at the back of the page, you see that the double broad and the medium got deep into the paper but never came through and touched the page underneath. I don't know that you could use the back of the page with the double broad, but you certainly could with the fine and the medium. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we've got a more blue turquoise than I think we've had on the other papers. It doesn't look like it's the same tone. It seems to be affected by this paper just a little bit. Now, it's not feathering. It's not spreading. Yes, technically it is giving some shading. When you look on the second line, the word instead certainly gets lighter towards the end of the word. And they seems to start a little lighter on the T, get darker on the he, but lighter into the Y. So it's there, just not stand out. Looking at the medium nib, it is a bit darker than what we had in the fine. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is showing some shading, which I was not expecting, but I'm very pleasantly surprised with. I'm going to take back my feathering. On the inside of the F, on the top line, you see a little bit of feathering there. So this paper's not perfect. There are some moments. Now, as far as the shading, you can definitely see it with words to words. Mathematics on the top line starts lighter and gets darker, and the underneath is darker than some of the words around it. Looking at the double broad, it is just a tad bit darker than we were getting with the fine as a tone in itself. It feathers a lot all over, but very tiny and really noticeable right in the middle of all of this writing. Third line, instance. Wow, a lot of feathering all over. There does seem to be a little bit of spread going on, but it is a double broad. Regardless, it does seem to spread some. Shading, not really. Looking at the back of the page, I don't think you could write on the back of the page with anything other than the fine nib and be able to read what you wrote. But with as deep as it got with the medium and double broad, it never came through and touched the page underneath, so no bleeding. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Colorverse Morning Star. Here is KWZ Turquoise. Here is Pelikan 4001 Turquoise. Here is Robert Oster Aqua. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it is a different kind of turquoise than we had with the other papers. But it certainly does look kind of like a turquoise, kind of like a bluish. It feathers, it spreads, it doesn't really shade. Don't have high expectations with this paper. Looking at the medium nib, really watch while I'm speaking here. Really watch the letters as they go down onto the paper. Now, it feathers, yes. It spreads right before your eyes, but that's not the real magic of what's going to happen here. It doesn't shade. It looks gross, but completely a fault of this paper. Honestly, when I finish this season of this paper up, I'm probably done with it forever. Looking at the double broad nib, it is darker than we had with the medium. It feathers, yes, it spreads amazingly. Just take a second and watch it spread as I write. It was amazing how it practically doubles in thickness. It's gross. It's the paper, not the ink. Does it shade? No, it doesn't. I'm glad it doesn't, because I don't want it to have any redeeming qualities here. Looking at the page underneath, I just got tired of circling things, and there was so much that I just called the whole page garbage, because that's what it is at this point. And when you see the back of the page, there's no question why, with the amount of ghosting, you can't use the back of the page. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Ackerman, their number 20. Here is an orange ink by Califolio, their Itsuyama. Here is a magenta ink by Krishna, their Wild Cherry. Here is a yellow ink by Krishna, their Yellow Valley, even though it looks very green. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, it is turquoise. It does feather very manageably. It does spread very manageably. It does not shade. So it's really doing what we expect on this paper. I would not call this bad so far. As long as it doesn't bleed and destroy the page underneath, I might consider this one pretty okay considering the paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is a bit darker than we had with the fine. A little bit more of the turquoise, I think, shows up better here with it being just this little bit darker. I think the tone here is nicer than what we've seen on some of the other papers. It does feather. It does spread. Neither of those should be a surprise given that it's copy paper. It doesn't shade. Not a surprise. It's... I don't know. I got a bad feeling about this. Looking at the double broad, it is a bit darker than we had with the medium, a lot darker than we had with the fine. It feathers, but the feathers are much smaller than we had on the last paper. I would actually call the feathering that's going on here rather under control and manageable. Same with the spread. It is spreading, but I would almost call this manageable because I have low expectations, and it doesn't shade at all, which isn't a surprise. Looking at the page underneath, the double broad, can't use it on this paper. The medium, maybe sometimes. The fine you can, it didn't touch the page underneath. But looking at the back of the page, you can see that you cannot write at all on the back or you'll lose all of your notes. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? Using a fine nib, I definitely get the turquoise and shading. Now, a wet pen made this look much more blue than turquoise, though it's still shaded. Go for a medium flow fine, maybe a drier fine for the turquoise, or you're missing the point of this ink if you use it in a wet pen because it's going to be blue. Don't miss the point. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you did, do all that YouTubery stuff. Thanks for watching.